As the saying goes, we don't live in a perfect world, and things don't always go the way we want them to. And Survivor is no different. Some amazing characters go home far too early, and some extremely boring and overall bad human beings can dominate the game. World events can cause Survivor to change locations, and even change the amount of days played. Twists may not come to fruition, a season might have a dark cloud over it, and more. And as much as we love Survivor, even the superfans can admit it's not perfect. So when it comes to returning players, it also isn't always perfect, as circumstances causes certain players to not come back when production, and for that matter the fans, want to see them play again. So, in order to compensate for the big time players not getting on, production is forced to replace them with lesser known players, making these players stand out as the elephant in the room, especially compared to the other players. Now, this can be twofold, as since these players could be considered as less deserving compared to the other big time return players, that can make them an easy target right out of the game. But on the other hand, since they're not that big of targets, they can make a deep run in the game, and go from a WTF returning pick to a Survivor legend. So today, let's go through the history of WTF returning players in Survivor, and look at the success and failures of each one. Now obviously some of these players can be pretty ambiguous when it comes to if they deserve to return or not. For example, I absolutely think Troyzan deserved to come back, especially compared to most of the cast of Game Changers, but there's obviously quite a lot of people who would think of him as a WTF pick. So we'll play that by ear as we go through the seasons. And lastly, for circumstances like say the Edge of Extinction returning players, while you could say it was unnecessary and questionable why those 4 specific players were brought back, at the end of the day, all 4 of them are obviously memorable players, and despite the unnecessary circumstances to bring them back, that doesn't make them WTF picks. With that said, let's look at the first returning player season in Survivor history, Season 8, Survivor All-Stars. And I gotta say, Survivor hit the absolute jackpot when it came to getting the best cast they possibly could in the pool of players that they had to choose from in the first 7 seasons. Pretty much all the big names from those seasons came back, with even pre-merge boots like Boston Rob and She-Ann being massive characters in their respective seasons. The only 2 players that Survivor wasn't able to get was the first 2 Survivor sweethearts, Colleen Haskell and Elizabeth Hasselback. So, they were replaced by the 2 other younger women from their seasons, and Jenna Lewis and Amber Birch, the 2 players on the cast who most people had a hard time considering all-stars, especially compared to the rest of the cast. But man, did these 2 women, who should be completely forgotten about by now, not only change the course of this season, but change the course of Survivor history. Jenna Lewis started the game on the Saboga tribe, and to her credit, took charge of her tribe, and was the main person to start the anti-winners thought in All-Stars. Now, obviously getting the winners out was easy for all the non-winners out there, but still, it was pretty interesting to see arguably the least deserving all-star out there play hard right away and be the one to go straight after the top targets. So after escaping the first 2 votes on Saboga, she then merged in with the Shapiro tribe, where she joined the tight core Shapiro alliance, mainly the tight duo of Rob and Amber, and she brought in her tightest alliance member on Saboga, Rupert. These 4 would not only dominate the opposing Moga Moga tribe, but they would pick off the minority players in Shapiro. And at the Final 4, Jenna was put in an interesting dilemma, as since Amber and Rob were obviously taking charge to the end, this left her with the decision to go to Rocks in order to save Rupert, and give her more options, since obviously the concept of the fire making challenge hadn't been a thing yet in Survivor. I do ultimately think she made the right decision, as even if say Amber went home on a rock draw, she loses to both Boston Rob and Rupert anyway, so her best chance was to try to win the final immunity challenge, and take Amber with her to the end. Unfortunately for Jenna, she lost the final immunity challenge, and was ultimately voted out on day 38 as the final jury member. But considering she shouldn't have even been on the season, I don't think she was at all disappointed with her run in All-Stars. And then of course, there's Amber Birch. And yeah, Amber's game is pretty much nothing. She fell in love with Rob out there, the 2 formed an alliance all the way until the end, and due to Rob doing all the work to save Amber, he burned more of the jury, thus giving Amber the win in a 4-3 vote. Yes, in a season that featured 4 winners, legends such as Rob, Lex, Jerry, Colby, and Rupert, Amber freaking Birch was ultimately the one to come out on top. And of course, Rob and Amber would eventually marry, have 4 kids, Rob would go on to win his own season, and the 2 would eventually compete with each other in Winners at War. So the first 2 true WTF picks of returning players definitely had an impact, and ultimately made future players and fans aware of just how dangerous the lesser threats could be in a return. Jenna was the main head to target the big time threats, and Amber, on her second shot, would go on to win the season and find the love of her life. Hard to imagine what Survivor would have been like had it been Elizabeth in her spot, like production, and for that matter, the fans originally wanted. In Season 16, we got fans versus favorites, and for the most part, the favorites were some of the most beloved players to ever play Survivor since All-Stars ended. And yes, while Fairplay definitely wasn't a favorite, to say people weren't excited to see him back would just be a flat-out lie. The only two players on the favorites tribe that were question marks were Parvati and Amanda. And guess who made up the final two? Now, to be fair to Amanda, she definitely had a better run than Parvati her first season, as she made the final tribal council. Her and Ty were one of the most dominant duos in history, and she pulled off some big-time moves in China. But still, she didn't really have much of a personality, and even though she had a great run in China, I think she was most remembered for her blurry bottom. And as for Parvati, she got naked in a hot tub with you and Ozzy? Yeah, not really much of a resume to be brought back. But similar to Jenna and Amber, these two women changed Survivor history, but this time in the absolute best of ways. After Fairplay quit, which spared Parvati, as she was a lesser-known player and easy target for the favorites, Amanda and Parvati both got into a showmance with Ozzy and James respectively, which left Suri in the middle of that alliance, and the other alliance made up of Penner, Amy, Eliza, and Yao-Man. Suri ultimately went with the pairs, thus giving Parvati and Amanda the numbers, and ultimately formed a final three with Suri. However, Amanda and Parvati were then split up, but this was a blessing in disguise, as on the new Arari tribe, Parvati made a pact with Alexis and Natalie, and brought them into her alliance with Suri and Amanda, and these five would ultimately form the Black Widow Brigade, the most dominant alliance in Survivor history. These women blindsided men with idols in their pockets, and granted us with one of the greatest moments in Survivor history, with Eric giving up his immunity necklace. The two ladies then got really lucky once again, as after they reached the final three with Suri, who would have beat both of them, instead of a final tribal council, there was one more challenge, which Amanda won, and she brought Parvati with her to the end. And in the end, Parvati beat Amanda in a 5-3 vote. So for the second time, both the WTF returning players had a massive impact on the season, as they literally made up the final two, was a part of the greatest alliance in Survivor history, and gave us some insane tribal councils, which ultimately cemented Micronesia as one of the best seasons ever. And maybe even more so than Amber, and especially Jenna, Parvati and Amanda went from memorable players at best to some of the biggest icons in Survivor history, with Parvati being on most people's Survivor Mount Rushmore. And I do think it is pretty interesting that after Jenna and Amber had such an impact on All-Stars, that a player like Parvati was originally going to be the first boot, as I'm sure everyone was worried a player like her could sneak her way to the end once again. But Parvati, and for that matter Amanda, didn't just slide their way to the end, they absolutely dominated their way to the end, and showed that sometimes great things can happen even when it's not the original plan. Thank you, Candace, for being in the depths of medical school at the time of Micronesia. In Heroes vs. Villains, I don't think there was really any WTF picks. Again, while it was obviously ludicrous that Candace was on the Heroes tribe, it doesn't make her return unwarranted. And I really think the only questionable pick was Danielle, but considering the women's villain field was pretty low compared to the other fields, and she was a big-time character in Panama, she certainly wasn't the worst option. After 3 captain returning player seasons, we then got a second edition of Fans vs. Favorites, with a minor league version of a favorites tribe, as basically only Malcolm, Brenda, Cochran, and Eric were legit fan favorites, who were also very memorable. And similar to Fairplay, while Corinne, Phillip, and Brandon Hance were pretty much hated by the public, they were still pretty big players in their original season, and you can understand why production brought them back, although I do think they regret bringing Brandon back. But the main questionable returning picks this season were Andrea, Dawn, and of course, Francesca. I mean, let's get it right out of the way. Francesca was the first boot of her season in Redemption Island, and literally the only reason why she was brought back was due to her being a main conflict for Phillip, and production was hoping the two would have even more conflict this season. However, Francesca decided to come to a truce with Phillip and put away their differences, but Phillip was having none of that, and wanted to make her the first boot of this season once again, especially since it would be so easy for everyone else to get on board to vote for Francesca, considering she was such an easy target, as she obviously wasn't on the level of everyone else on the favorites. And despite an actually pretty good effort from Francesca to get the numbers on board to blindside Andrea and save herself, she was once again voted out first. Now, while this was obviously unfair to Francesca to be paired with Phillip and be a first boot against some well-known players, it is interesting that such a non-threat was taken out first once again, and finally a non-threatening player was booted early in a returning player season. But since she was such a non-threatening player, other players like Brandon and Eric wanted to keep her and take out Andrea, who they thought could possibly be the next Parvati of Fans vs. Favorites. And that's the thing with Andrea. While she definitely proved to be a solid player in Redemption Island, she was nowhere near the caliber of, say, a Brenda, which is what made her a threat going into Fans vs. Favorites, and she also tried to play like Parvati, as she joined Philip's Stealth or Us alliance and formed a bit of a showmance with Eddie, who of course was tightly aligned with the three amigos. So going into the merge, she had plenty of options, but ultimately sided with Stealth or Us, who slowly picked off the rest of the minority. However, when it came time to turn on each other, Andrew's relationship with the last outsider, Eddie, was too obvious, and the other five split the vote on the two, and Andrea was voted out with an idol in her pocket. And lastly, there's Dawn. Now yes, she was a sweet lady and a great competitor, but come on, you can say that about so many other ladies in her archetype who we've never heard from again. But to be fair, she made the most of her second chance, as her and Cochran, the eventual winner of the season, basically dominated the season together. Unfortunately for Dawn, Cochran's game was much more flashier, and he received all the votes at the final tribal council. But still, despite the lackluster of respect from the jury, Dawn definitely had an impact on the season, as not only did she dominate Caramoan with Cochran, but she was also involved in one of the most controversial incidents in Survivor history with the Brenda Teeth debacle. So the three WTF picks in this version of Fans vs. Favorites had an abysmal run, a good run, and yet another run that led to day 39. Blood vs. Water is an interesting season in terms of returning players, as yes, a lot of the returnees are not players you'd expect to be brought back, but production was obviously looking to get the best loved ones they possibly could for this season, whether their relative was noteworthy or not. But in Blood vs. Water, we unbelievably got 3 returning players from One World, arguably Survivor's worst season. Now, say what you want about Colton, but his 6 episodes in One World were far more memorable than the 16 combined episodes from Monica and Kat, who were the epitome of being brought back because of their loved ones, as of course Hayden was a Big Brother winner, and Culpepper was an NFL legend. While Kat was basically a non-factor this season, Monica was the dawn of the season, as with being such a non-threat, she was able to get in a comfortable alliance with Tyson Jervis and ride with them to the end. Unfortunately, she was seen as a follower and only received 1 vote at the final tribal council. We then also got Laura Moret, who to be fair, had a pretty funny rivalry with Shamo and Samoa, but that season was basically the Russell show, and she was a mid-game boot with only 16 confessionals. But in Blood vs. Water, she had an absolute iconic run. She was a challenge beast, winning her way back into the game through the Redemption Island duels, and then of course, we got one of the most iconic moments in Survivor history, and a moment that is still memed to this day. She voted out her mom. Yes, Laura's own daughter voted her out of the game. And despite this being super beaten to death, especially since Sierra's vote didn't matter, it was still crazy to see. And in general, Laura and Sierra's relationship throughout the season was the epitome of what made Blood vs. Water such a great concept. Laura once again dominated on Redemption Island, but in the last duel, she lost to Tina Weston of all people, and her crazy Blood vs. Water run came to an end. So once again, the WTF picks here did good, bad, and a combination of both. But considering the wacky circumstances of Blood vs. Water, it is pretty hard to compare these players to other players on the list. In Second Chance, we got another interesting scenario, as these WTF picks were actually voted in by the audience, so I guess it's hard to really call them WTF picks, since obviously the fans wanted to see them more than players like Shane and T-Bird, but still, for the sake of it, let's talk about it. Now, similar to All-Stars, there were absolutely players like Terry, Spencer, Cass, Jeremy, and Wigglesworth who fans absolutely wanted to see get a second chance. And players like Tasha, Wu, Savage, and Varner, who while not quite as memorable, definitely fitted in perfectly with the type of season theme. Now, while players like Shireen and Kimmy are questionable choices, you can understand why they're voted back in. So I think the very clear WTF picks this season, especially considering they beat the likes of T-Bird and Carolyn, is Monica Padilla and Kelly Wentworth. Monica was a complete dud this season, as she was the first buy-on boot of the season, as she lost the trust of the tribe trying to pull off a women's alliance. However, Kelly Wentworth went from a Kelly to a Wentworth due to her performance in Cambodia, and is the epitome of taking advantage of a second chance. In her first outing, Kelly got 6 confessionals and was the 5th boot of the season, and would be an absolute nobody in Survivor history. But in her second chance, she found 2 idols and nullified the most amount of votes in Survivor history with them, was a part of the Witch's Coven, was a figurehead in many of the season's blindsides, and ultimately came 1 challenge away from possibly winning the game. Her 2 idol plays are 2 of the most iconic moments in Survivor history, with the first one creating the ever classic Wentworth will not count phrase among Survivor fans. And the best thing about this is that literally nobody could have saw this coming. I mean, even WTF picks like Jenna, Amber, Parvati, and heck, even Francesca were far more notable than Wentworth in their first season. And in a season full of challenge beast, underdogs, and strategic masterminds, and the general craziness of Cambodia, this made Wentworth not even a thought to be a possible target in Second Chance until the merge. But then they were all in for a massive wake-up call when they tried to gun for her. So similar to Parvati, Wentworth went from a literal nobody to a Survivor legend after a second chance. And lastly, in a season literally called Survivor Game Changers, we saw an insane amount of WTF picks, as over half the cast were nowhere near game changers. The final 3 this season were all decent characters at best, who if anything, were more fitted for a second chance season. You have players like Caleb, who definitely deserved a second chance after what he went through in Ko Wrong, but to be considered a game changer was pretty laughable. And then you have players like Zeke, Michaela, and Debbie, who while they all had good runs, to put them on a season with legends like Malcolm, Tony, Sandra, and JT was simply insulting. So while you have to question most of the cast fitting the Game Changers theme, there's still an argument to be made that mostly everyone on this season had a reason to be brought back. But the 2 main WTF picks that I just cannot fathom in any way were the 2 Worlds Apart girls, and Holly Ford and Sierra Dawn Thomas. I literally can't think of one thing they did in Worlds Apart, much less any game-changing moves. And the 2 were pretty forgettable this season as well, as yes, they weren't targeted right away for being a potential Parvati, but they also didn't make a late game run. Holly became the first jury member once again this season, the first and only player to do so, while Sierra did have a notable instance with the season's winner in Sarah, as after she was voted out, she gave her legacy advantage to Sarah, despite Sarah also being in on her blind side. One of the most underrated moves by a winner ever, as this advantage basically guaranteed her alliance to final 3. But again, what makes this season so frustrating is that the real game changers this season were basically all taken out in the pre-merge, leaving WTF picks and somewhat notable players at best to dominate the end portion of the game. So there you have it, guys, the history of WTF returning players in Survivor. As you can see, these unexpected returning players have had quite the impact on Survivor. Amber and Parvati both went on to not only win Survivor, but change the course of Survivor history. Complete nobodies like Wentworth and Laura Moret became Survivor legends after coming back for a second time. But then you also have WTF picks like Francesca, Kat, and Holly, who either didn't add anything to the season, or got even worse on the second time, despite their lack of star power. With season 41 being tabbed as a new era of Survivor, it looks like it will be a while until we get a new returning player season. And in this new era of twists and turns, meat shields, and crazy advantages, it will be interesting to see how future WTF picks do, especially when you look at the history of these WTF picks. I mean, people are already speculating on which female pre-merge boot will get picked for the next second chance season, but because of what a pre-merge boot like Wentworth did in Cambodia, there's a big likelihood that someone like an Allie Elliott will be targeted early once again, in fear of her being a potential Wentworth 2.0. So while in a perfect world, we want to see players like Elizabeth and Colleen in All-Stars, Twyla in Micronesia, and T-Bird in Second Chance, sometimes things not going to plan can not only lead to great moments, but to the birth of Survivor legends. Thank you guys for watching. If you like what you see, then hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know what other type of success and failure videos you would like me to do in the future. Tell all your friends about my channel, and leave a comment down below of what you think. Have a good one, guys.